Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's pull back the curtain and open the door. Get some stuff that's not bought and paid for. Let's herd border to border, coast to coast. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome on into another podcast by George. Got a great one for you today. We're going to learn something, and it's one of those stories that just kind of leaps off the page at me. I mean, this is something that I just had to do, and with the podcast, I do what I want to do, so we're going to do this one. Before we get there, I kind of wanted to touch bases on the politics of the day, because it's breaking on a daily basis, and you probably saw a lot of the stuff on Bloomberg's candidacy, and we talked about him a little bit in the earlier podcast with Stephen W. Schmidt, the Lucan Endowed Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University. And here's what I tell you about Bloomberg, just so that you know. This guy was a Republican. Actually, he was kind of a keynote speaker at the 2008 Republican Convention. He spoke against John Kerry there, and he spoke in favor of George W. Bush. And of course, that's the architect of that misbegotten war in Iraq. And as I've said before, anybody that was a proponent of that was either too dumb or they were in on it. And either one is a disqualifier as far as being the president of the United States is concerned. And Michael Bloomberg falls into that category for me. The other thing I wanted to mention was, if you're following Twitter and you're looking around, all of the personalities and celebrities are weighing in with their endorsements and opinions. My God, I saw Barbara Streisand on Twitter talking up Michael Bloomberg, saying what a wonderful guy he was, that he puts his money where his mouth is, and that he should be the next president of the United States. I look at that, really? This guy's worth $62 billion. How much of his money has he really put towards these causes? How much of that $62 billion does that guy need? Could he put $61 billion towards a cause and keep $1 billion for himself? I think he probably could. I don't think he's going to. And when it comes to Barbara Streisand, I'm reminded of P.J. O'Rourke, the great conservative columnist, actually, that used to appear in the Rolling Stone. And in the Rolling Stone, he said, why, when it comes to politics in the United States, do we put such grave reverence in the opinions of musicians? We're talking about guitar players here. And he talked about actors and actresses would fall into the same categories, but he said, why don't we put the same kind of reverence in the opinions of circus jugglers? I've never forgotten that. P.J. O'Rourke. So when you see Barbara Streisand waxing poetic about Michael Bloomberg, ask yourself why anybody should care. Oh, because our opinion is just as valid and maybe more important. So get your news and views from Podcast by George instead of Babs and a Star is Born. Well, let's turn our attention now to the topic of the day. And this is the article and the information that I've been following that kind of leapt off the page at me. Maybe you've seen it in some places. It was in USA Today. I'm just going to read the headline here. And it says, 1/3 of all plant and animal species could be extinct in 50 years, according to this study from the University of Arizona. Researchers studied recent extinctions from climate change, because they're going on all the time. I hope you've been following this. And they estimated the loss of plant and animal species by 2070. Sound like a long time from now? It's not. We're talking about the lifetime of your kids or your grandchildren, certainly. And their results suggest that as many as 1 in 3 species could face extinction unless warming is reduced. And we've got one of the co-authors of this study on the podcast by George live line, and it's John J. Wiens. He's professor down there at the University of Arizona. Welcome on into a podcast by George, Professor.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So tell us about this. I was kind of shocked. I mean, this is much more serious than I would have thought. We're a third? Man, that's a hell of a large percentage.
Yeah, that 47% out of like 1,000 species that have been surveyed already had local extinctions. So that was, this sort of relatively unbiased sample of species, and nearly half of them already had local extinctions. And that's given the relatively minor climate change that's already happened, right? So, given that much more climate change could happen, it's almost not surprising that we would come up with an estimate like 1/3 of species disappearing.
We better start paying attention to this, and I'll try to play the devil's advocate, because it's not very easy for me, because I don't know where people that don't believe science or don't follow this, I don't know where they're coming from. But some of these folks might say, well, don't worry about this warming in those areas where they'll just pick up and move. It won't affect them that much. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, well, so that was actually the idea of species moving I think is one of the most important things that came out of our study. And what we basically found is that most things don't move fast enough. That's the bottom line. So what our study was based on is looking at a whole bunch of other studies that had surveyed species distributions over time. So what you see is at the hot edge of the species range, like at the lower elevations, a lot of species disappearing, or populations disappearing. And then at the cool edge, like higher up in the mountains, a lot of species expanding their ranges. And so the bottom line is, if they can move up fast enough, they won't go extinct, right? And so what we found is they basically don't move fast enough. And almost 2/3 of the species that we looked at were hardly moving at all. So that was sort of one of the big takeaways from our study, is that the species just dispersing is not going to do the trick. It's not going to be enough for most species.
And some people look at this data, again, I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but they may look at it and say, well, these are just toady frogs down there in the Amazon, and God made this planet for mankind, and things have been becoming extinct ever since there have been things, and this is just part of the natural progression. But there's nothing natural about this, and this is not the natural rate of extinction we're talking about, right?
That's right. And I actually, haven't been involved with those studies that are looking at the rate of extinction, but, 1/3 of the species in 50 years would be, unprecedented. Yeah.
And
it's all kinds of plants and animals. So it's not just, there have been a lot of frogs lost in South America. In terms of whole species extinction, that's been one of the most important patterns that's been seen so far. But our projections are sort of we're trying to estimate everything: plants, animals, lots of insects, birds. And so it's all sorts of different groups.
The other thing people are missing too when they look at a story like this, and this may not be your bailiwick. I know your focus is on what you focus on, obviously, but I look at that and I'm just a guy with a basic education, but I'm thinking everything's intertwined. It's all interrelated. So if this many plants and animals become extinct, or this kind of rate actually occur, this is going to affect humankind drastically, dramatically. I mean, we might be next. We're dependent upon these things. It all works together. It has to, right?
Right. And I mean, we depend on plants, right? We actually depend on a fairly limited number of plant species. About half of the calories that humans consume come from only about 3 species in the rice family. So we're totally dependent on them. And the insects, they seem like they may be some of the most unimportant ones, but we depend on them for pollinating all the plants. So, we just say, oh, it's just a bunch of insects and plants. It's like, well, we do need them to stay alive.
And I was also taken aback a little bit because, and I've had some climate scientists on the podcast before, and they've talked about this specifically. My question always is, how bad is it? And has there been some harm done that can't be undone? That if we change a lot of things, and whether or not we're capable of that, I don't know. But are there some things that have already occurred that can't be undone? And you pointed out that if we were to kind of like readopt or get re-involved in those Paris climate accords, Paris Climate Agreement, yeah, that we could slow this rate down to maybe like 20%?
Or 16%. That was kind of the overall estimate that we had, was sort of we could take it from 30 down to about 16%. And those are kind of an average across different projections. But yeah, so basically we could, it's a bad number. It could be cut in half though. It could be cut in half just by doing what we had already said we were going to do. So, in some ways the story sounds really grim and nightmarish, but at the same time, I think it's kind of hopeful. We just do what we said we'd do, and we'll save a lot of these species, I think.
When you review or analyze the Paris Agreement, is there anything in specific that you think is most important, or is it the agreement overall in general that needs to be readopted and implemented?
Well, I think that the agreement overall, but there are some things I really like in it. One of the things that I most like is the idea of saving rainforests to suck up carbon, and because that is a kind of a 2-for-1 special for biodiversity, right? Because if we cut down all the rainforests, regardless of climate change, we're going to lose 2/3 of the species on the planet, right? That's, independently of climate change. Cut down all the forests or let them burn, like in the Amazon, then we just lose most of the species on Earth. So if we preserve those rainforests, not only do they help suck up carbon, right? So they reduce climate change, but they also, just doing that also preserves a ton of biodiversity. So that's maybe one of my favorite things about it.
And when you undertook the survey, when you started this process, did it just reconfirm what you already suspicioned, what you already knew, or were you surprised by these findings?
We were surprised by the findings. Yeah. So for example, I thought that dispersal would be more important and that more species would disperse. But that's one of the things that surprised us. Yeah.
The only other question that I had, it was a study on plants and animals. What about the distinction? Are they, again, I think about this intertwined thing, but I mean, what's the greatest threat to mankind, let's say? Is it the extinction of plant forms or animals?
As in terms of a threat to mankind itself, I mean, extreme weather is part of it, right? I mean, massive flood. I mean, what's the sort of stuff we're experiencing already, like massive flooding, right, in the United States, all of these hurricanes. So some of those are some of the most direct threats. Obviously, rising sea levels. So those things are more, things that are going to directly impact and cause loss of human lives, right? And then sort of the plant and animal diversity is kind of another thing, but also potentially intertwined. And it's a bit of both. Not all plant or animal species are ones that we depend on. So that's something I would readily acknowledge, right? But some of them are, and in a lot of cases, I think it is a moral issue, right? Is that it's not right that we should just let all these species go extinct because of our actions. That seems morally unjustifiable, and I don't think that for the idea that we should preserve these things for humans is maybe the best. But there's also we don't know what these things can do for us, right? There could be cures for cancer, all sorts of things that these species could do for us if we just let them live and we study them, right? So again, not the most important justification, but we don't know what they can do. They've all been evolving for millions of years, and they've all come up with all kinds of solutions to life's problems, some of the ones that we're still struggling with, right? So we don't know what they can do for us.
Well, it's a dire warning, and it's mostly bad news. Congratulations on the study itself. Now, this is your life. This is your career. It's research, and research never ends. Is there a next phase to this? Do you just go on? Are you moving on to another area or category of analysis, or is this what you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one thing I should point out, this is actually part of the PhD dissertation of my student, Cristian Roman Palacios, who's from South America, who's from Colombia. And so one of the things that we'd like to explore in the future is to understand basically why some populations are going extinct and why other ones aren't. So already it's about 50-50, right? Or at least among the species. And so we want to try to understand the generalities of who's going locally extinct, who will go extinct, and who won't. And we also would like to understand more about the mechanisms. So like when we're already seeing these widespread local extinctions, we don't necessarily have a great idea what's causing them. So our study revealed that it's these hottest summer temperatures that seem to be really important, but we still don't know, exactly what the sharp end of the spear is. So for example, a lot of these frog species are being lost through diseases. We know lots of bird populations are declining because of reductions in their food supply. So lots of different mechanisms could could be going on. So we'd like to understand, what's actually driving those mechanisms, both the mechanisms of extinction and the mechanisms of survival.
Well, I get it. And I just am just listening to you talk. I'm reminded of, my childhood. I read a short story, science fiction. Robert Heinlein, I think, was the author. And the premise of it was a guy had the ability to go back in time, and it was a futuristic society that had the ability to do that. But they had to, when they went back in time, they had to stay on like this conveyor belt or platform. I mean, it was the one and only direction that they got. They had to do that. Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about.
Sound of Thunder, yeah.
Okay, and the dude stepped off. I don't know what he did, but it's some little minor thing. He squashed a plant.
And crushes a butterfly. And then they look at his boot afterwards and they see the dead butterfly caked into the mud, right? And in that story, there's just been an election. And they were like, whew, we just avoided having this terrible guy as our president. And he comes back and he stepped off the path. And all he did was to step on that butterfly. But the other guy won the election. That's the end of the story, right? And so the end of the story is actually the guy who's leading this tours back in time takes a rifle to the guy who stepped off the path. And that's where the sound of thunder comes in.
Oh, okay. All right. I'd forgotten that part for the good of all of us. My God, but there is a moral there. That's great that you remembered that, because I just brought that out of right field. I mean, that's the way these things go. Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to leave it here. Anything now? I'll give you the last word here, because you're the man. You're the guy that understands a hell of a lot more about this than I do. What's the takeaway you want for folks to have?
So I've said this a few times, that this is not like an asteroid striking the Earth and it's causing massive extinction of the dinosaurs. This is something that we have control over. Whether it's going to be 30%, whether it's going to be 55% species loss, whether it's going to be 10% or less, this is something that we have control over in the next 50 years. So, in some ways, it's sort of the nightmare scenario is possible, but so is a much less devastating scenario. So I just, a cause for alarm, but also a cause for hope.
All right, that's well said. That's a great place to stop. I'm going to post a link to that study out of the University of Arizona so that folks can check it out, because it's not a bored, drying research kind of a thing. It's good reading. Check it out. I mean, we need to know this. But wanted to thank him for coming on the podcast and being a part of our show today. That's Professor John J. Wiens, and he's down there at the University of Arizona. And this is how dumb I am. Where are you at? What city?
Tucson.
Okay, he's in Tucson, so that's great. Joining us on the Podcast by George live line. We'll be back soon. Want to encourage everybody to check us out on Twitter, all the various platforms. We're on YouTube. Look for us there, because we're putting a lot of the videos there, and of course on Facebook. And we'll be back very soon. But for right now, that's another podcast by George.